In this video, we're going to take a brief look at the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18, verses 9 through 14. So I'll read the passage first here. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So, a couple of things then we need to kind of note about this parable. We really need to get a good understanding of the Pharisees, and we're not going to be able to go into a great deal of detail about that. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the Pharisees amongst particularly Christians. They're oftentimes seen just as the opponents of Jesus, and so people generally just have a negative characterizations of them. But holding just a negative characterization of them does a kind of injustice to this group. One should remember that the Apostle Paul, at least was a Pharisee. Now, Philippians 3 might even indicate that he continues to practice the law according to Pharisaic interpretations of the law. And so there would not necessarily be any reason why he couldn't be both a Pharisee and a Christian, because these have to do with, different types of allegiances to show obedience to God. So one is how one practices observance of the law in such a way to maintain the integrity of the law. And the other one is the confession of Jesus as the Christ, which shouldn't interfere, as it were, with a person who still wants to obey the law, since Jesus himself taught Jews to be obedient to the law. And plus, we also see that in the book of Acts, there's a number of Pharisees who end up kind of joining the Jesus movement. We don't say convert it to Christian as if you are a Pharisee and you convert from Pharisee into this faith, but here are Pharisees who adopt the faith that Jesus is the Christ. So they're not as antagonistic to each other, being a Pharisee and being a Christian. And so it's kind of unfortunate that the term Pharisee is used or looked at primarily negative by many Christians. And we sometimes use in kind of polemical language, well, you're being Pharisaical, meaning you're acting like a Pharisee. And we tend to think that just means, a narrow-minded allegiance to the law, or you're being hypocritical. And some of this polemical use comes from, again, how we see the Pharisees arise in the Gospels. But a little bit more about them. The term Pharisees probably means separated ones. It comes from a Hebrew word to mean to separate. What's kind of interesting is we don't have, except possibly the Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians, we don't have any practicing Pharisee who uses the name Pharisee to describe themselves. It seems to be a term that is used by others to describe these people. So even Josephus, a Jewish historian who kind of talked about the Pharisees, described them. He once was, followed Pharisaic oral interpretations of the law, but no longer does. And he'll use that term. And we'll have other works that will talk about this group, but it's not very clear that this is a term that would be used as a self-designation. In other words, these people use this term. So, why did it arise? Well, what does it mean, separated ones? Well, there's lots of different speculation. The one that makes the most sense to me is that this is a term that describes a particular focus the Pharisees towards tithing, that is, to separate a tenth of one's goods in order to dedicate to God. And there does seem to be evidence both from the Gospels as well as from rabbinic sources, particularly Mishnah, that indicates that tithing was a very important activity of Pharisees that showed how scrupulous they wanted to be in demonstrating their desire to protect law observance. And Jesus even commends the Pharisees, about this. He does talk about, you will tithe mint, dill, and cumin. So these small spices that would come into one's house, you will take a tenth of that and set it to aside, dedicated to God. In other words, you won't use it for your own purpose or good, but somehow you dedicate it back to God. And you do this while neglecting, weightier matters of the law, like justice, mercy. So Jesus says, well, you should have done the latter, focused on justice and mercy, without neglecting the former. So Jesus says, that's good that you're tithing these spices. That's wonderful. That's appropriate, but don't neglect the big laws. So to separate, or the separate ones, the ones who maybe separate, or it could be that these are individuals who, again, want to maintain some kind of distance from immorality or idolatry or neglect of God's major laws, that they might have separated themselves from people who they saw were engaged in behaviors that were bringing God's judgment down upon God's people. So it's not clear exactly how the name arose to describe these people, but it has something to do with separation. We also see that they are lay people. So when one hears the word Pharisee, you shouldn't be thinking in terms of clergy. They're not clergy. So these are people who, they have jobs. They are, they can be workers on fields and workers on farms, and they can have their duties, their jobs. But being a Pharisee refers to a particular outlook of things that are being emphasized, being protected, because now Jews are living right next to or right along with non-Jews, and so that this kind of cohabitation in the land with non-Jews presents a problem, because then there's the temptation to become more like the non-Jews and their practices, and to give up things that would have made being a Jew distinctive. And so it looks like the Pharisees were people who wanted to try and maintain an emphasis on distinctive laws that helped to identify one as a Jew, or purity laws, we might call them. So we see this issue about washing of hands. In other words, not trying to contract ceremonial uncleanliness and passing that on. Sabbath observance, which of course is a very distinctive Jewish thing. Other people are not practicing the observance of one day of not working, and the temptation would be, for a Jew maybe to work on that day and to just not regard it as a special day, or eating certain foods which now non-Jews would eat, and again become available, and maybe a temptation to Jews. So here are people who are trying to maintain what is considered the traditional practices of Jews, what they would see as obeying God's law in order to stay within this relationship, this covenant relationship that they have with him. The group arose sometime during the Second Temple period. It's very hard to pinpoint exactly when this group kind of, we see people with these attitudes. We also have to be careful about the term group. This is not an organized system. It's not like they have a convention. It's not something like they have wear badges where they all know that they belong to a designated group. They don't have like membership cards. It is just people who share an outlook, who are kind of known for their scrupulous behavior. So we see people being called Pharisees, at least somewhere around the second century, kind of the almost the ending of the second century BC. And so during the time of the Hasmoneans, this group seems to have arisen. And so there again, it may have been as a response to what they may see as Hasmonean rulers who are capitulating, as it were, to kind of Gentile practices. And so somewhere in the second century BC is probably when we start seeing people being called Pharisees. According to Josephus, at the time that, in the first century, he claims there were somewhere around 6,000 people who were Pharisees. Now, how we know this number, how we calculate this number, we're not sure, but this is a number that it at least is given. So you can see by that number, and when you can think about the population of Galilee and Judea, that 6,000 is not a large number. So we're talking about a small group of people who hold this view, but Josephus does see them as the largest of a kind of an identifiable movement of people who hold a similar view. It's interesting that Stephen Wright, New Testament scholars, thinks of them as kind of enforcers of tithing to the temple, and he provides some evidence in his work on this issue. I am not so sure that they are enforcers of tithing to the temple. It is an interesting aspect if that was the case. So seeing tithing to the temple as something like a tax, well, then you get, in this particular parable, you would have two people who are collecting taxes, one a tax to the temple or a tithe to the temple, and the other one who is working for taxes for the Herodian government or for Rome. So it's questionable about that, and I think Levine as well may be throwing some objections in terms of what kind of role the Pharisees actually control. I mean, they don't really control things in Judea or in Galilee. So this idea of enforcers of tithing, I think we need to probably be somewhat cautious before we are willing to buy into that presentation of them. So what were the duty of tax collectors? This other character in the story? Well, there are two kinds of taxes, basically. There are the direct personal and land taxes, and these are collected by state officials. And there are indirect, or one we might consider customs, which were collected by a contract agent. That's probably what we have here as a tax collector, is a contract agent. And so the agents that collected the indirect taxes had to bid for the right to collect them and would pay the money to the government in advance and then recoup their money through assisted tax collection. So if we imagine this tax collector, he has bid it to give to the Romans a certain amount of taxes from the population in his area, his district. And so, all right, you give us the money that we expect out of this area. And of course, an agent who's trying to bid for that has to be very careful, because if he bids too much and then can't collect that from people, then he has a loss. Or if he bids too much and tries to extract too much out of people, he could cause a revolt, and there could be unrest, and the Romans will not like that too much. If he bids too low, well, then other people may outbid him. And of course, the Romans are going to try and get as much tax as they can without causing a revolt. So the agent who has to do this, has to be very careful about how they go about doing their bid. And once they get the bid, then they pay up the money, and then they can recoup it. And of course, assisted tax collection, I mean, they're going to need some potential soldiers, or they're going to need some kind of enforcement in order to collect it, because a lot of people may not want it to pay the tax, and if they don't, what could happen to them? So they need some kind of enforcement in order to do this. So, but primarily, as Levine will point out, the tax collectors are people who are associated with the Romans. So here are Jews who are helping, as it were, the Romans. They're collaborators with the Romans. And so they may be themselves people who are behaving in ways kind of like the Romans. They may be relaxed, as it were, on observing certain Jewish laws, and particularly think of the Sabbath. I mean, if you're a tax collector, are you going to stop collecting taxes, especially on customs, just because it's the Sabbath? And, if so, well, then people might want to move their goods on the Sabbath as to avoid collection of taxes. So you may not have an option to, as far as the Romans are concerned, not to keep collecting taxes on every day. So anyway, so they might be seen as betrayers or collaborators with Rome, and probably are primarily seen in a negative light. So in terms of the historical context we have here, the men have come to the temple during one of the hours of prayer when sacrifices are likely to have been offered. Now the text says that verse 11 stood by himself. It could be, instead of stood, the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. The Greek could be he stood and prayed to himself. Now, I was not quite sure what would be meant by praying to oneself. If you are praying to yourself, well, then obviously there's a problem, because you're supposed to be praying to God, not to yourself. Or it could be that he is stood and prayed about himself. And we see in the prayer that he does talk about himself. But I think as well, something we probably should keep in mind is, in Luke's gospel, individuals who talk to themselves, think of the prodigal son who does this, the rich fool who does this, these are usually negative characters in a parable. And so this is probably what we're seeing here with the Pharisee as well. He is talking to himself in this posture of prayer. The prayer is about himself, but of course he would be praying to God, because that's who you're supposed to pray to. So the language by himself is probably reflecting something of Luke's, interest in presenting the Pharisee in a negative light. Now, Luke doesn't always present all Pharisees in a negative light. Luke sometimes has Pharisees who are helping Jesus. So Luke knows that there are Pharisees that can be supportive of Jesus, or not as hostile to Jesus, and there are Pharisees who are hostile. So being a Pharisee is also, it's not a monolithic group. There are lots of different Pharisees with lots of different views, and the Pharisees themselves would debate with one another about how to be scrupulous. So in a lot of ways, for many Pharisees, Jesus himself, because he was scrupulous about law observance, could look like someone who would want to be a Pharisee, or might self-identify as someone who shares their same kind of outlook. But of course, he also has other behaviors that many Pharisees think is odd or strange, or does not seem to be scrupulous, particularly his table fellowship with tax collectors and people who are called sinners. The content of two men's prayers are really not that extraordinary. Some people read what the Pharisees prays to God, and he does address God. But we do have other evidence where people do talk about, telling God, reminding God of how they are being observant to his law. They're appealing to God for mercy based upon showing law observance, and God does expect law observance. And so it might look strange to us. It might look haughty and arrogant, and probably in Luke's gospel, it is supposed to be presented as someone who is confident about his own righteousness, and has some kind of pride in what they're able to do or in their diligence towards the law. But it's not that unusual, and certainly what the tax collector prays is not really that unusual, to pray for God to have a mercy and a recognition, a confession of their lack of obedience. To call oneself a sinner is to say that there's a recognition, I've not been obeying your law, and probably even big laws, major laws, as he ought to have been. The tax collector ends up beating on his chest. It is not usually done by men, especially in a public setting, except in extreme social distress. And so we do have illustrations of men beating their chest, but these are like national mourning for the way in which God is punishing the people, and to show, a recognition of distress, and recognition of what God is doing, and seeking for God's forgiveness, and for them to be freed from their punishment. So it's not a common thing just to go out in public and beat one's chest. It is showing an intensity. So in the Jesus context, so we not look at the historical context, we almost see how this fits in Jesus' ministry. Jesus often exhorted his audience, and particularly his disciples, to be humble before God. And so, there may be something here where Jesus is, again, maybe have something in mind of Isaiah. Isaiah played very heavily in Jesus' ministry. And so maybe Isaiah 66, where, it talks about God having mercy upon the humble. And so, here we see the tax collector demonstrating humility, and that's what's really important before God, walking before him humbly. And Jesus encourages this kind of humility, not to be self-centered, to be thinking about others, to have care and concern about others, not going around bragging about your own righteousness or bragging about your own achievements. Now, in the gospel context, so it only appears in the Gospel of Luke, so this is a part of what's called the travel narrative, which begins in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, and will conclude in Luke 19, verse 27. And Jesus is headed towards Jerusalem and his confrontation with chief priest. So, we've got a temple setting, and Jesus is here headed towards the temple. He's on the move here. And when he's on the move, it's in the travel narrative that he's particularly telling his disciples. He is talking to them about how they ought to live. Now, disciples is a large group, it's just not the 12. And so, there are some amongst his disciples who may be having a kind of a confidence about their righteousness as they are moving towards the temple. So here is a reminder to be careful if you are taking too much confidence in about your ability to be observant to God's law, instead to have the right kind of attitude when one goes to pray. It follows the parable of the widow and judge, and this is also where talking about this idea of praying, where the widow is asking this unjust judge to grant her something, and so the parable of the persistent widow, as she sometimes is called, this widow, she can ask an unjust judge and get what she wants. So how much more should believers be able to pray to God, who is not an unjust judge, and expect that God will grant what it is that they need. So we have this kind of connection with prayer and thinking about prayer and about the way in which one should, when one prays, and approach God. And in Luke's gospel and in the book of Acts, prayer plays a really big part in the way in which Luke writes his gospel and writes Acts. So in terms of interpreting the parable, well, Luke provides the information around it to kind of show at least how he sees the parable and the meaning of the parable. So it's not about exalting yourself before God, exalting yourself above others, and so how much more your righteousness is, or how much your law observance is, how well you're at keeping God's will. But instead to humble yourself, look at yourself, and to realize your need for God's mercy. So, and if you do humble yourself before God, then He will lift you up. He will exalt you. And so, as one thinks about the hope that Christians have about the coming of God's kingdom, one should not think about entering to God's kingdom as something that one has earned, that one is justified to have, but instead to realize that anything that is granted to yourself from God is a part of God's mercy. But instead, if He does grant you that mercy, then He will raise you up, as it were, lift you up to experience that life in the age to come. It's interesting to note some of Levine's interpretations. She says the way the parable would have worked in Jesus' ministry is you can't judge or dismiss one character over the other, that both characters, in a sense, standing in need of God. Both of them are praying. But divine grace cannot be limited. So we're not here to just say that God is only going to be gracious to the tax collector. It's also to the Pharisee that grace is needing to be offered. And that's important for us as readers of the parable to remember that we need to be gracious to the Pharisee because we ourselves can fall in the same kind of trap of thinking more highly of ourselves when we compare our lives to other people's lives. But she also mentions the idea of we should be generous to others, realizing that others will tap into our own goodness. Now, here I'm not so sure I buy into this part of the way in which she's reading it, but I do recognize, yes, it is true that within some Jewish thinking of the time, God, the way God looks and works, He works with the people as a whole. And so He will punish the people as a whole for the disobedience of a large number of people, and He will also come and rescue people based upon the righteousness or the law observance of a number of people. So in kind of what I would refer to as martyrdom theology, we will see that. And Christians share this in part. We recognize that it is because of Christ that God turns favorably towards us. So because of one person's righteousness, we can receive God's mercy. But what we're probably not thinking about as much, and probably is not so much the point here, is I'm helping somebody else get the righteousness that they need. So I don't really see that as the thing that Jesus is trying to convey to his disciples at this time in the Luke context. And it's hard to imagine how exactly he would have used it. Levine is offering up a possibility here, but it doesn't seem to fit to the other kinds of things that Jesus said. I don't really see Jesus teaching anywhere else that we need to realize that others are going to tap into our goodness. So if that was the case, if we could see clear teaching of Jesus where He does that, then I think that point of Levine's could have more weight. So I will leave that as our overview of the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector.